Well, I wanted to let you know we are live streaming our education content for our program today. Thanks to our sponsor, Shepherd Audiovisual, for partnering with us. As many of you know, our Southeast chapter spans over 7 states plus Puerto Rico. This innovative addition allows our members from surrounding states to join us for our program today. I wanted to thank our people that are online for joining us and definitely encourage you all to ask questions of our speaker, as well as those who are here at the luncheon with us. John Foster is an attorney and counsel whose firm, Foster, Jensen, and Gully, specializes in the legal aspects of meetings and conventions, trade shows and events, and association management. He's been an associate or general counsel for over 400 national and regional associations and companies since 1986 and has been named one of the 25 most influential people in the meetings industry by Meeting News. PCMA voted John Author of the Year in 2003. John's professional experience includes 12 years as Director of Sales and Marketing for Hyatt Hotels and Resorts, Marriott Hotels and Resorts, and Holiday Inns, and he holds the Certified Hospitality Executive designation from the Hotels Sales and Marketing Association. John handles in-house legal training as well as contract preparation and negotiations for corporations and associations nationwide. He is a well-known expert in the hospitality industry, and he speaks frequently at industry events worldwide. Please join me in welcoming John Foster.
Thank you, Terry. Hope everybody's wide awake and ready to go. Like I said earlier this morning, if you're caffeine deficient, then please pinch yourself to stay awake for another hour, or ask the person next to you to pinch you or whatever to keep you going. Because I think we're going to be talking about some very interesting things this afternoon. When bad things happen in good meetings, preparing your contracts for disaster. How many of you were, need to back up a second here. How many of you were in the morning session? Okay, how many of you are attending this session for the first time? We're not in the morning session. Okay, so we've got a few new people. So this is going to be an entirely different session than what we talked about this morning. We had a great inter-exchange of questions and issues this morning. We touched on force majeure issues, but this is going to be a little more in-depth. Force majeure clause is one of the 3 big clauses that take the most time to negotiate and are the most contentious. Attrition and cancellation being the other 2, and then force majeure. It hasn't always been that way. Force majeure clauses used to be sort of perfunctory, and I'm going to show you a sample what they used to be, what some of them still are. But I'm going to give you examples of what it needs to turn into. I'm sure you're going to have questions as we go along, and like I did in the first session, I invite you to raise your hand and ask questions. We're going to limit this session strictly to an hour, and then we've got to move on. But I welcome the people that are live streaming as well. So let's go ahead and jump in here. I wanted to go ahead and give you my contact information, so that if you want to write that down, if you want to follow up, have questions after this, or need assistance, you can contact me that way. Email is probably the best way to follow up with me. I always respond to emails. The phone number there is actually forwarded to my cell phone, so no matter where I am, I take phone calls, and if I'm involved like I am right now and you call, I'll follow up with you. So I'm fairly easy to get in touch with, so follow up that way. And I'll show the slide at the end too. Since this is a legal presentation like I did in the first one, I give a disclaimer and say I'm going to be talking in generalities. It may not be answering the questions that's on your desk right now, but if you do have legal questions that come up, my advice is to contact an attorney, whether it's me or somebody else in the industry that's familiar with your particular issue or problem, to give you advice on it at that time. Here's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about why and how force majeure clauses and contracts have changed in recent years, potential force majeure events that can affect meetings and travel, the legal standards for invoking the force majeure clause, and tips for preparing your force majeure clause in your contracts. Force majeure clauses have become extremely important because of, in the last 15 years, 18 years actually, because of the events that have happened in the world that have affected meetings and travel that hadn't happened before, starting with 9/11, 2001. Prior to 9/11, we had not had jets flying into office buildings. After that happened, people didn't want to fly very much. People were concerned about when the next event was going to happen. The Ayatollah, condemned all the infidels in the world, and Saddam Hussein said he was going to shoot airplanes out of the sky if they were anywhere in Europe or in the Middle East. So it was kind of a contentious time. Then you started seeing headlines like this one that said, hold on, I need to move ahead. Terrorist attacks caused declines in meetings and hospitality industry. People just didn't know when the next shoe was going to drop. And so it became a big deal, particularly for association planners who had no control over how many people show up at their meetings in the first place. And so then the next thing came along, 2003, that my partners and I were involved in, was the SARS epidemic has massive impact on travel and tourism in affected destinations. I think there may be someone here from Toronto Tourism, and great, okay. Toronto, well, this case here, I'm going to talk about Toronto for a second. Toronto's one of my favorite cities. During this particular controversy, they didn't do anything wrong. This was an unfortunate situation that happened to hit their city. And my wife lived there one particular time, and I've been back there many times and have some favorite hotels up there. So I'll say that Toronto did a good job. But I represented a group called the American Association of Cancer Research. You may remember that out there. I got a call one day because the hotels had gotten together and sent them a bill for $6.5 million. What had happened is that they were meeting in April, the first week in April, I think it was, and they picked up their board of directors were there. They picked up the newspaper and they were reading every day about how many people got infected or how many people dropped dead the day before from SARS, and it was a pretty bizarre situation. And because the American Association for Cancer Research, all their attendees were doctors, 2/3 of them canceled because they all worked in hospitals, and they were all told that if you go to Toronto during the first week in April of 2003, you're going to have to stay in quarantine for 2 weeks when you come home, and that was unacceptable. And so without any attendees and their speakers canceling, they didn't have a need to hold a meeting. So they canceled the meeting, terminated the contract, and went home and went about finding a different city to hold it in. And Toronto, obviously this was a controversial situation. That's when they got together, worked through Tourism Toronto, which again was a great organization, we're good partners to work with, and asked them to compensate the hotels to the tune of $6.5 million. And the position we had was, when we booked, there were some legal issues involved here because of the force majeure issues. But we were also dealing with Canadian law. And the issues were whether or not the law required the group to show up and subject themselves to a deadly disease with no known cure, and we maintained no, we weren't required to do that. And the hotels took the position of, we showed up at work, our doors were open, nobody dropped dead on our staff, you guys should have been here. So we had an interesting controversy. And the real reason the AACR called me is because they actually had an insurance, the convention cancellation insurance through Travelers, big company. And the Travelers they'd paid a $40,000 retainer for the insurance, premium for their insurance. And the insurance company turned down the claim for the same reason that the hotels gave. But we convinced the insurance company to accept the claim because it wasn't excluded. If you know anything about insurance policies, it has 2 pages of what it covers and 32 pages of what's excluded. And you got to read the exclusions are more important than what they cover because that's where the meat of what they rely on. And we pointed out that epidemics and diseases were not excluded. And so they sort of scratched their chin and realized that that's true, that weren't excluded. So they ended up accepting our claim and asked us to negotiate with the hotels to settle it. make a long story short, we ended up mediating this event in Toronto. And the insurance company, like I said, agreed to pay the claim. And we ended up settling it for a sum certain with each hotel up there. And there were 18 hotels, I think, under contract, as well as a convention center. Again, they didn't do anything wrong. This was just an unfortunate business situation. And so the hotels got some of the, covered some of their losses. I'm sure they didn't feel like all their losses were covered. But the group suffered some losses too. And it was a real contention, but the insurance stepped in and paid some of it. But now the insurance companies all exclude epidemics and diseases. They didn't then, but this case taught them to exclude epidemics and diseases. Just like after 9/11, they exclude terrorism. And so the only way to get the exclusion removed is to pay extra, have the exclusion removed, and or have limit what you're responsible for in the force majeure clause. And the purpose of the force majeure clause, although I got a slide on this, I'll go ahead and mention it, is to say if one or both parties are prevented from performing due to acts outside their control, then the parties go back to zero. And the position we took was that, look, we'll pay for our losses, meaning the group, but you pay for your losses. Don't ask us to pay for your losses. And that's how it ended up. But from that day forward, I changed my force majeure clause to include epidemics and diseases or any other risks of harm that our attendees might be subjected to. I don't name SARS because next time it could be something else, like the Ebola virus or the Zika virus or the avian bird flu or the disease of the week. So I don't name it. I just say any other epidemics or diseases or situations that subject potential attendees to unreasonable risks of harm. But anyway, this came along, we wrote it. Then we had Hurricane Katrina come up in 2005. We all remember Hurricane Katrina, plus we've had several hurricanes since Katrina. New Orleans got buried under water, and the city of New Orleans was closed to meetings and conventions for 6 months. I think that happened right around Labor Day in 2005, and the hotels closed for 6 months after that, which brought it to April. And their position was, we're suspending, all the hotels are going to be closed while they renovated and got themselves back in order. But if you had a meeting coming in there, on April 2nd, they expected you to show up. And there were a lot of issues about perception of whether the city was really ready or not. And again, the city of New Orleans didn't do anything wrong. I'm not here to pick on them. It just happened to be an unfortunate situation. So we're going to talk about how to deal with that. Here's an article I wrote for PCMA about a year ago called Ebola Disasters in Your Meeting. And if you'd like a copy of this, it was in Convene magazine, but I'd be happy to send you a copy of it if you want to send me an email. But it talks about a lot of things we're going to be talking about today. So you got, epidemics and diseases and the way that they affect travel. You've got strikes and labor disputes. There are a lot of groups that don't want to cross strike lines. If your local culinary union or a local hospitality union, this picture happened to be in San Francisco where the hotel workers there were on strike. There are a lot of groups that don't want to cross picket lines and or don't want to meet it because they don't want to be involved in labor disputes. And if the employees are out picketing, then who's taking care of the meetings type of thing. And I know that most of the big chains have plans for that and they fly in management people from other hotels and so forth and so on. But still the issue is whether or not the groups want to be involved or want to hold their meeting at a facility that has a labor dispute going on. And that's a case-by-case issue. Then we've had headlines like this, Scottish, Irish, Northern Irish airports shut by volcanic ash. I got calls from some of my planners over this. And it was mainly in Europe, but in Greenland they had a volcano go off. Whoever thought of this? And it blew the volcanic ash, 1,000 miles away. And they had to close the airports because the jet planes suck in all that ash, and it's a hazard to the planes. It messes up the aeronautical GPS, or the whole thing. So they couldn't fly. So who would have thought, that type of thing would come up? Then you see Ebola wasn't bad enough. We have the Zika virus, and I still see pictures of mosquitoes in the airports and telling people to be, if you're flying in from certain countries. Fortunately, Zika didn't rise to the same, and Ebola didn't rise to the same level of severity in the United States that the SARS epidemic did in Canada. Fortunately, that didn't happen, but it could have. And so people wondered, how do I change my contracts? And my friend Vince Alonso, who's the editor of, this was in Meetings and Conventions magazine, wrote a list of top 10 things. You can go online and find this, but his number 10 was get your force majeure strategy in place. And again, that's what we're going to be talking about here. So I've sort of listed these in the handouts for you and discussed them in the articles. You can fill in, pick a disaster and insert here. You can't think of everything, and so your clause needs to be all-inclusive and not just limited to, fires, government intervention, riots that make performance impossible. That limits it to those 4 things unless you have other language in there that we'll talk about. And the language would say, or any other events similar events that make performance or acts or occurrence that make performance difficult or make performance impossible or frustrate the purpose of one or both parties or makes performance commercially impracticable. And I'm going to share those standards with you in just a minute. So, talking about preparing your contract for disaster. Understand the difference, and I talked about this morning, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this. The difference between the cancellation clause and the force majeure termination clause. They're 2 different clauses. And even though there are some default issues in contract law that if there's nothing in your contract about force majeure or termination, the law provides that under certain circumstances, contracts, so your performance can be suspended without liability. And I'll tell you what those are in a minute. But the law also allows the parties to specify in the contract what the excuses of performance are. And that's what I recommend you do. And I'm going to come up and show you a list of some of the items that I include in mine. But cancellation clauses are designed to compensate the injured party for potential damages that they may incur, whereas for the force majeure or termination clause, I'll usually add the term in there, excuse of performance. And as I said this morning, it's really an excuse of performance clause. It specifies that if certain things happen that trigger the clause, then one or both parties is excused from their performance without liability. And so it's better to clarify it up front so that the parties don't get in a dispute about it later. Again, I gave the definition this morning, cancellation versus termination. And again, so the contract is terminated, the rights and obligations cease to exist, meaning both parties go back to 0 and they're in the same position as if the contract had not been entered into. Now, some people say, well, gee, that's not fair. If the group isn't able to perform because of whatever, but the hotel's ready, willing, and able to perform, the hotel's going to suffer because of that, and that's not fair. Well, it is fair. That's what the purpose of insurance is for. Hotels can get business interruption insurance, it's called. Just like the groups can get convention cancellation insurance, it's up to the group to insure their losses. The hotel says up to them to insure their losses. And I'm sure some of the hotels, in Toronto, perhaps had this insurance. That was none of my business whether they did or not, so I didn't ask them. But again, that's the role of insurance, as opposed to making one side have to pay their own losses as well as the other party's losses. You both look to insurance. All right. Why is there such a pushback on force majeure and termination clauses in the industry? And there is a big pushback because it means different things to different sides of the equation. Force majeure means one thing to a hotel and a different thing to the planner. To a hotel, a force majeure means it's totally impossible for the meeting to be held or for the hotel to provide its facilities or services. In other words, if the Scud missiles are hitting your headquarters or the Scud missiles are hitting the hotel, then yeah, you can call off the meeting, but short of a disaster like that, we expect you to show up. Whereas to a meeting sponsor, it means entirely different. It means any act or event that occurs after the contract's been signed that materially affects the meeting and makes it substantially more difficult to either stage the meeting that's planned or to attract the number of attendees that's planned. And this is mainly directed toward what I'm talking about is associations, and most of my clients are associations. They plan an event years and years in advance, and they have no clue who's going to show up until the registration opens, 3 to 6 months in advance, and they really don't have any idea who's going to show up until the first day of the meeting and everybody shows up. So a meeting sponsor, plans, and assuming it's not a corporate meeting that requires attendees to show up, they don't know who's going to show up, and they have no control who's going to show up. And so the contract needs to recognize those differences and to contemplate that type of thing. One thing I do to contemplate that is I talk about a purposes clause, purpose of the meeting, and I'll say, the purpose is to attract attendees in the XYZ industry from around the United States, or I may say around the United States and Europe, or internationally, however it's, whatever the attendance is, for purposes of traveling to the United States or traveling to the host city, the XYZ city, and all performance obligations are based on the group's ability to meet this purpose and not without interference, from acts or occurrences outside their control that would affect attendance. But I also put in there and go further after Hurricane Katrina about the reputation of the city or the reputation of the surrounding area. Like I said, City of New Orleans didn't do anything wrong, but after the 6 months went up, there were a lot of negative images that came out of that. I won't elaborate on it, but there were a lot of negative images. A lot of my groups had attendees that didn't want to show up, and they told the sponsors of the meeting that they didn't want to show up. I had other groups that supported their planning organization, say, sure, we'll show up, we'll support it. But the problem is for the sponsors whose attendees said we're not going to show up, they didn't have any choice but to cancel their meeting because they didn't want to hold a meeting if nobody was going to show up. And so I wrote an article about doing your due diligence and polling your stakeholders, like your sponsors, your exhibitors, your potential attendees, to find out whether there's support for showing up in the situation. And so I wrote a clause that's part of my purposes clause that says if the reputation of the city or the surrounding area changes due to, outside the control of either party, and it materially affects attendance, then the group has the right to terminate the agreement. Now, usually I get pushbacks from the hotel and say, well, gee, we can't control the reputation of the city. Why are you saying that? And I go, bingo, you can't control it, but neither can we. And if we can't make the people show up, why is it fair to hold us responsible for it? And so, and I'll usually put in there that you'll do attendee surveys and affidavits to get their reason for not showing up. I realize it's controversial, but it's a matter of what makes sense to you, and that's my take on it. So let me keep going on this before I'll stop for questions and see if you have any. As I said, there's a default, there's several default positions for force majeure doctrine and contract. So even if there's nothing in the contract, there are 3 situations that will allow a party to suspend or to prevent or stop their performance without liability. One, if performance is impossible, and I got the word objectively in there. That means not only is it impossible for that group to perform, but it's impossible for anybody to perform. It can't be just particular, the impossibility can't be just particular to that group. It has to be widespread that it would affect anybody. So impossibility, the second one is called the frustration of purpose doctrine. I touched on that already, but it means the fundamental purpose of one of the parties has been frustrated because of new events. A primary example of that, excuse me, I'm sorry, I've got an allergy this time of year. The primary example of that was our situation in Toronto. It wasn't impossible to hold that meeting, but it was a classic example of not impossibility, but it was materially more difficult for us to get people to show up. Matter of fact, people told us they weren't going to show up. And so it wasn't impossible, but it was a frustration of purpose of our reason for being there. It was also impracticable. Performance, impracticability says performance is not impossible, but it's been made impracticable, which means substantially more burdensome than originally expected due to an extreme or unreasonable event that the parties could not have reasonably anticipated. That last phrase is very key to force majeure, that the parties could not have reasonably anticipated. Now, what that means is if an event can be anticipated and it's not included in the contract, then the law assumes that the parties meant to waive it. You've waived the right to complain about it later unless it's extremely extreme, like the hotel burns down. And it also means that once an event happens in this industry that affects attendance, like terrorism, like Hurricane Katrina and storms, like epidemics and diseases with SARS, once something happens once, then it's now anticipated, and it needs to be or has to be included in your contract, or else you've waived the right to complain about it. You can't complain about epidemics and diseases unless it's in your contract, because it's happened once and we have an example of it. This is why people ask me all the time, when the economy goes down, like in 2008, 2009, when the economy went down and attendance was short at meetings, people call me all the time and say, can I blame the economy as a force majeure event that's the reason why I'm not performing? And there's actually been a court case on that, and the court held that everybody knows the economy goes up and the economy goes down, so it's not unforeseeable. And so economic instances are foreseeable, so unless it's mentioned in the contract, you can't bring it up later and complain about it. So if you want the changes in the economy to affect your contract, and I have language that deals with that, but if you want changes in the economy to affect your contract performance, then that needs to be in the contract because it's foreseeable. And epidemics and diseases are now foreseeable. There are all sorts of things. Government quarantines are foreseeable. All those things are in there and have to be listed in your contract. It probably won't surprise you that my force majeure clause for certain meetings can be a page long, because it needs to say all that. I've got a shorter version, but the shorter version, isn't as comprehensive as the bigger version. So you pick and choose depending on your mood that day. So, I just because a meeting, there's a difference, I know you look and think there's a difference between a 20-room meeting, 20 rooms versus 200 rooms versus 2,000 rooms. The legal issues are all the same, whether it's 20 rooms or 2,000 rooms. The legal issues are still there. The only thing that changes is the dollars and cents. So how extensive you want to make your contract or your force majeure clause depends on how much you want to assume the risk that something bad's going to happen, and whether, if the risk occurs to 20 rooms versus 200 rooms, whether your organization can assume the risk and have the money to pay for it versus arranging your contract so that you're not liable for it, as i.e. what we're talking about. So those three standards need to be mentioned in contracts, and most of the contracts I see today that come out from hotels have strictly refer to impossibility. They don't talk about fundamental purpose clause or the impracticability. And notice the word is impracticable. The word is not impractical. I mentioned that this morning. Impractical has no legal definition. There's no legal definition for that. Anything can be impractical. But impracticability is a specific legal term. But here's what, a typical impossibility clause. It just says, no damages shall be due for a failure of performance by either party, occurring due to acts of God, war, government regulation, riots, or strikes, any one of which make performance impossible. The party so affected must notify the other party within 3 days of the act or occurrence. This exact clause was was the subject of a lawsuit in 2006 called NAPUS versus Hyatt Regency Washington. And this made all the industry news because this clause had been in there. And NAPUS is a National Association of postal workers in there. And they had a meeting planned at the Hyatt Regency in Washington. They had a force majeure event. I don't remember what it was, but they waited 10 days to tell the hotel about it and say, we're terminating our contract due to X, Y, Z. And the hotel challenged it and said, no. It says in here you're supposed to tell us in 3 days, not 10 days. And so the whole subject of the lawsuit was whether or not 10 days versus 3 days, which one is right. And the court held that they were going to strictly construe this contract to limit it to 3 days. So these clauses are strictly construed. If it says 3 days you've got to notify somebody of your decision within the 3 days. I think 3 days is too short of a time, so I usually say within a reasonable time, or commercially reasonable time, not to exceed 30 days, whatever. Because if there's some sort of disaster going on, the first 3 days, you might be doing some other risk management strategies as opposed to thinking about your vendors. But yeah, you got to tell your vendors at some point. But just realize that these clauses are strictly construed, so whatever you put in there. The other problem with this clause is it limits triggering this clause to impossibility. It does not mention impracticability or any of the other things that I've talked about. And it also limits it to the way this language is written, limits it to, acts of God, war, government regulation rights, disaster or strikes. Anything else isn't included. So, it needs the language or any other similar acts that make performance impossible or frustrates the purpose of one of the parties or makes performance commercially impracticable. So you need to have the all-encompassing words because that's what's realistic today. Again, I know that hotels tend to be weary or leery of the force majeure clauses because they think groups are going to use it as a free get out of jail card. And that's not what the intent is. At least when I prepare them, it's not intended to be easy to get out of a contract. I believe that contracts are very serious and need to be honored. And if you breach the contract, you owe damages, pay the damages and shut up and move on. But if there are extenuating circumstances, then the law allows, developed over the last 200 or 300 years of contract law, allows the party so affected, as long as it was outside their control and meet certain standards, to say that you shouldn't be held responsible for it. And again, both parties can get insurance to cover that, as I mentioned earlier. But just realize that the hotels have a right to feel like that, but the clause itself should be self-explanatory, that there are certain criteria or certain checkpoints that have to be met before the clause applies. It's not just, open-ended, we got a force majeure clause, we're going to terminate, goodbye. I mean, the group always is subject to being challenged in court, and they have to show why it was impossible or why it's commercially impracticable. Go ahead. Turn it on.
We had an interesting event
Speak up
happen.
so I didn't hear you over here, Terry.
It wasn't that we couldn't hold the meeting. We held the meeting. But the last night of the event, we had a very large banquet, and it just so happened that a hurricane was coming up alongside of Florida. The hurricane missed Florida, but I don't know if some of you remember it. It did hit Virginia, North Carolina. So a lot of people were very, very nervous over the fact, and some of the airlines started canceling flights and telling people if you didn't get out by Thursday night, you weren't going to get home the entire weekend because we couldn't guarantee. We ended up having close to 100 people leave the event early, and so we then went to the hotel and basically enacted our force majeure clause for those 100 because our guarantees were in, our dinner guarantees were in, but we were looking to lose over $10,000 in guarantees if we had to pay for these people that had to leave. It was not easy, but they did end up working with us, and they gave us, along with, of course, we had to produce news articles and proof that the airlines canceled the flights that affected those people. But because we had the impracticable in there, it allowed us to be able to cancel it and not have to pay quite a bit of money out.
Well, I think that's a very valid situation. I'll give you another case example of that. But what I think you did right in that is that you showed up with the people you did have. You didn't cancel. You showed up with the people you did have, but you were prevented from being responsible for the people who left because of the weather that was outside of your control. And so that's why this came up this morning in the meeting. People asked about putting a restriction on the number of people that have to be affected before you can terminate, before you can invoke the entire force majeure. And one of the things I've got coming up, but I'll go ahead and mention it, is that you need to put in there whether we're dealing with total cancellation or partial cancellation. What we're talking about here is partial cancellation, saying if 30% of the people, for instance, can't come, then we have the right but not the obligation to terminate the agreement. But if we don't terminate, we'll show up with the other 70%, but we're not responsible for the 30% that were so affected, so it would affect the cancellation. But I had a situation similar to that. This is going back 10 years ago, and I don't remember the hurricane in question, but I had a group that was supposed to go to Savannah, and they were supposed to move in on Friday and start their trade show and meeting on Saturday. And on Wednesday of that week, there was one of the hurricanes coming up from Florida was supposed to come inland in Savannah. And they were, if you turned on the Weather Channel and turned on the news, they were evacuating Savannah and they closed the airport. Evacuated Chatham County, and everybody in Savannah was traveling up I-75, I-16 first, and then 75, getting out of the county. They were all coming to Atlanta to stay. And so I got a call from the planner and said, what am I supposed to do? They've closed the airport. People can't fly in there. The installation dismantlement people were supposed to show up on Friday and set up the exhibits and so forth. And we made the decision that, I think you've got the right to make the decision when the decision has to be made. This is Wednesday. We're in an industry where you got to make decisions several days in advance. You don't wait till the morning of to see what happens and react to it that afternoon. You got to tell people. So they canceled the meeting, terminated it. Well, as it turns out, when Friday rolled around, it was nice and sunshine because the hurricane went further up the coast into Georgetown and Myrtle Beach area and skipped Savannah. But the point is, the group, that Friday morning, they weren't going to call up their attendees and say, oh, go ahead and show up at the airport and come on down here. By then, people had canceled their tickets and had already made plans. And we took the position we made the decision when the decision had to be made. And the hotel didn't like it, but they accepted it and realized that was the case. So it's on a case-by-case situation that you look at it. But your situation is another example where you showed up with the people that you could show up with, but you weren't responsible for the people that were affected by the force majeure. Any other questions like that or comments? Okay, we'll keep going. I'm sort of illustrating what each of these legal standards are. And practicability of performance, in plain English, it means a party's obligation in a contract may be discharged if performance is impracticable by some extreme or unreasonable events occurring which could not be reasonably expected to have been contemplated by the parties, i.e. foreseeable at the time they made the contract. So this was an example of the SARS epidemic in 2003. That had never happened before. There'd never been a worldwide epidemic or disease that affected travel. And so it was unforeseeable. And prior to September 2005, when Hurricane Katrina came along, we'd never had bad weather shut down an entire city before. It had bad weather before, but we didn't have one shut down the entire city for 6 months. And so these things, because they make headlines, are now foreseeable. They were unforeseeable before. And another thing, we've had other things come up, and there'll be things coming up in the future that we haven't contemplated, whether it's volcanic ash or some other reason we haven't contemplated. And so that's why your force majeure clause needs to say, or any other circumstances, but they have to meet one of the three criteria: impossibility, frustration of purpose, or impracticability. And impracticable is the midpoint between doable and not but doable. It's saying it's doable, but it's impracticable to do so. All right, we'll keep moving. Frustration of purpose, what you need to understand about that. A party's obligation can be discharged where the party's purpose in entering into the contract is destroyed or prevented by supervening events. And in frustration cases, the party seeking discharge is not claiming that he or she can't perform or that the group can't perform, like inability. It's just claiming it makes no sense for him or her to perform because what they get in return won't give them the value that they thought they had entering into it. And I mentioned this morning the example of you book a group books a golf resort for the purpose of holding a golf tournament, and then they find out a week or two in advance that the golf course is going to be reseeded or is going to be replanted, or they're going to lease it to somebody else or have a tournament there. Well, the group doesn't have any reason to show up and use the guest rooms there if their reason for being there has been frustrated, i.e. the golf course isn't going to be available. So it's like a contingency clause, but the one key point you have to understand is in order to claim frustration of purpose, the purpose has to be in the contract. It can't be implied, it has to be overtly mentioned in the contract so that both parties are aware of it when and if one of the parties wants to claim it. Here were three big cases that came up. The one in the middle I've already talked about, but one, frustration and purpose. It's a case that came up in Arizona, Scottsdale Plaza Resort versus Coon Farm Machinery. It came up in 1995. It was interesting because Coon Farm is a dealer in tractors and farm equipment. And they had planned a dealer meeting at the Scottsdale Plaza in Scottsdale. And they were inviting attendees to come from not only in the United States, but they had a lot of dealers in Europe and in the Mideast, and they were counting on those people, those dealers in the Europe and Mideast to show up. Well, the meeting was planned right a couple of months after Desert Storm happened in 1991, right after the United States invaded Kuwait that was our first invasion of the Gulf region over there. And after that happened, when bin Laden, before we got him, when bin Laden threatened to shoot every American jet out of the sky. And so people didn't want to fly after that. And the group canceled because the people that were in Europe and in the Mideast that were flying over didn't want to get on an airplane because they didn't want to be shot out of the sky. And the group, that was like 50 or 60% of their attendance. And so the Coon Farm said, well, look, if all these people can't come, we don't need to hold the meeting. The problem was that they lost the case because they did not put in the contract that the ability to get everybody from Europe or the Mideast to the meeting was important to them. They claimed frustration of purpose, but they didn't spell out that purpose in the contract. And so that case made it very clear that if you're going to claim frustration of purpose, you better explain what your purpose is in advance and put it in writing so that both parties understand it. In practicability, we've already talked about the SARS epidemic. I'm not going to go over that again. Impossibility versus impracticability. I've already talked about Hurricane Katrina and the Gulf Coast, that people could have shown up in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, but it was impracticable to do so. And again, once these events occur and they're foreseeable, you need to specify it in the contract so that both parties agree and not argue about it later on. If it's going to be contentious, you want to know that now during the negotiation phase. All right. Some other bullet points about this is, realize that force majeure clauses are a risk allocation. What you're specifying is if certain things happen, then the risk of non-performance is going to be allocated, and how that's going to be allocated needs to be specified in there. And the doctrines of impossibility, frustration, purpose, and impracticability apply only where the parties themselves did not allocate the risk of the events that have so made the performance impossible, impracticable, or frustrated. So what that means is that if nothing is in the contract, say there's no termination or force majeure clause in there, if nothing's in there, then those three standards apply as a default as part of contract law. But the better practice is to specify and to talk about the things that are foreseeable and are potentially anticipated, and make sure they're in the contract. So I've come up with some sort of tips for doing that. Number one is that your clause should be broader than acts of God. We're not just talking about hurricanes, tornadoes, and earthquakes. We're talking about man-made disasters too. God forbid we've got bombs going off and schools being attacked all over the place. So they're man-made disasters. So I call those any acts or occurrences outside the control of the parties. So that could be acts of God, meaning weather, or it could be man-made disasters like terrorism. You know, force majeure clause can include other contingencies that must occur or not occur that are significant to the party's performance of the contract. Keep on some other bullet point. You've got to determine whether, you know, the clause is about, let me back up, whether the clause, what the standard is. Is it total impossibility or temporary or partial impossibility? I provide for temporary or partial impossibility. I maintain that I put in there that if a certain percentage of people, whether it's 30%, 40%, whatever the economic breakoff point is, on a case-by-case basis, if they can't come, then the group has the right but not the obligation to terminate its obligations. But that they'll, if less than that, say your cutoff is 30%, but 20% of the people can't come, then I provide that the group can be, still has to show up with the 70% of people that can come, but that they're not liable in attrition or in guarantees for the 30% or 20% that's so affected by the force majeure. So it provides for partial impossibility or partial performance. And your contract needs to be clear about that. Some other points. Again, and I already said this earlier, realize that force majeure clauses are strictly construed. So the court will look to the four corners of the clause, and if it says you got to give notice within 3 days, then you got to give notice within 3 days. You know, if it says you got to give notice by the 30th day at 5 p.m., then on the 30th day at 6 p.m., you're late, you missed the deadline. And if events occur that you want to claim affect your performance, they were anticipated, they need to be in the contract or you're going to be deemed to have waived the right to complain about them later on. Some of the things that I include, acts of God, obviously. That's an important point. Hazardous weather, actual, and I put down actual or forecasted. Because like the situation, you got bad weather, hurricanes are forecasted, 5-6 days in advance. And if they're threatening the Weather National Hurricane or National Oceanographic Association is telling you that the hurricane's going to hit your city, you're not going to get a whole lot of people get on an airplane and fly there if that warning comes out over your dates, no matter what the weather is, the actual weather is. You've got to act on forecasted weather. But forecasted needs to be in the contract. And I put down war, declared or undeclared, or specific threat of war. Now, war, you still have to show how the war affects your performance. Just because your meeting's here in the United States and there's war going on in the Mideast and everywhere else in the world doesn't give you the right to point over there and say there's a war going on and so we're going to invoke that, we're not showing up. You have to show how the war over there affects your meeting over here, and that's probably going to be hard, if not impossible, to do. I did have a group that was made up of Army medics, and when we invaded the Middle East after the second time, these Army medic reserve were all called up and sent overseas, so they couldn't hold an annual meeting. And that was the example where war allowed them to terminate their contract because it directly affected Army medics. And then you got construction or renovation at the facility if it's going to affect performance of the group. I usually provide for government regulations restricting travel, including advisories, quarantines, or curfews. It so happens that and this was controversial, but when the SARS epidemic broke out, the Center for Disease Control located in Atlanta put out warnings and advisories against going to Toronto during that period of time. And again, the city didn't do anything wrong. It was just an unfortunate situation. But it became a very political issue, and after 30 days, the advisories were lifted. But for a 30-day period in there, they were advising people not to go, and they were telling people it wasn't safe. If you plan overseas meetings, you want to deal with government regulations by the United States or the foreign country that restricts travel, including advisories, quarantines, or curfews, or travel ban to a specific country or region of a country. You can go to the U.S. Department of State, and they have put out warnings whenever they put out warnings and advisories for every country in the world. You can put the country you're planning your meeting in and see if there's an advisory on their website about going there. They'll tell you, you'll hear about things on the U.S. Department of State. You'll find out things in there that you didn't see in the headlines. And so if you're going to a particular country, they'll tell you that they're having labor disputes there or whatever the case may be. You can also use the U.S. Department of State to find out if there's any national holidays happening in the foreign country that you're planning to go to. You want to make sure you don't plan your event over national holidays when everybody's going to be on a national siesta. You know, you don't want to show up and expecting to find companies that'll work for you. Susan.
Once the advisories have been canceled, then all that's
Well,
lost.
it depends. Yeah, the advisories, if you're meeting, if your advisory, it depends on whether your meeting's occurring during the life of the advisory. You're right. But I'll put in there that, if advisories are issued by the U.S. Department of State, then we have the right, but not the obligation. So say there's no advisory on there now, but your meeting's in 2 months, and 2 weeks before then the advisory comes out, you want the right to react to the advisory if they're advising Americans not to go to that country.
But what about the reverse situation if there has been an advisory and that scares a group, but then the Department of State cancels the advisory?
Well, I think then you got to put a date in there that if it's canceled by a certain date, then you got to show up. But if the advisory is still on there, say 30 days in advance, then I think you have the right to react to it and terminate it, even if they lift the advisory later on. Depends on how far in advance you need notice before you can pick up and move your event somewhere else. If you can move your event on 1 week's notice, then put 1 week. But if it's going to take you 30, 60, or 90 days, then you react to that accordingly. Because that's the same situation with the weather. We thought the bad weather was going to affect Savannah, but then it went somewhere else. But we made the decision 3 days in advance when the decision had to be made. So I think that's the best answer I can give you. Strikes, labor disputes, picketing, or work stoppages, again, actual or threatened. Because if there are groups that are threatening secondary, so a lot of times you'll get one union will go on strike, and then you'll get other unions do sympathy strikes or declare you're in the middle of negotiations, and you want to find. I usually try to find out if we're using one of my groups is using a union hotel. I want to find out when those union contracts are up for negotiation and whether that's happening around the time my meeting's there, because you're always going to have walkouts and potential problems if the parties don't come to an agreement. And it depends on whether or not that's a big issue to you. If it's not an issue to you about meeting at a hotel where the staff's on walkout, then fine. But if it is an issue for you, plan for it in your contract. This is where you plan for it in your agreement. Change in hotel ownership or management company. If you want to meet at a Renaissance hotel and it changes to something else, that's a big deal to you, or you've got the right to meet at some other Marriott hotel, then put that in the contract if hotel ownership or management's an issue with you. If your meeting is long-term, you're booking more than a year out, deterioration of the facility where the meeting's to be held. I reference that in there. Epidemics or diseases in the city or region where the meetings be held, or from where potential attendees would be traveling. I forgot to mention that earlier. In this case, in the SARS epidemic, it was determined by our government that the SARS epidemic had come from a certain area in China around Beijing, that travelers from Beijing had come to Toronto and had infected the city. And so the group the group I was representing, before they canceled, they actually uninvited the people from Beijing, told them not to show up. And then all their attendees and their speakers started canceling, so they didn't have any choice but to go ahead and terminate the meeting. But it's not just in the city where it's going on, but if you've got 30% of your attendees that are coming from cities that have Ebola or Zika or any other deadly disease like that, then it's not only the city where you're meeting, but if it's affecting 30% of the cities from where your attendees are coming from, it's the same issue, and you want to provide for that. But you're not going to be able to claim these after the fact. You can argue them, but you're not going to be able to legally depend on these until and unless you put them in the contract. So I'm just suggesting you do that. Damage or harm to the city or region material affecting basic governmental services or functions or risk to the city's reputation where the meetings be held. I put that in there. I call that my Hurricane Katrina clause because of the situation in New Orleans, and I've already discussed that. Damage to the reputation of the facility or city or region material affecting meeting sponsors' ability to attract attendees. And this is where it comes into new laws when we're talking about the issue, either diversity or the issue of bathroom laws or gender, this type of thing. If your organization is offended by these type of things, somewhere in this clause it needs to say, if you pass some law that we deem to be morally offensive to our members, we have the right. And some hotels may accept that, and some hotels may not accept that. But it needs, unless it's in the agreement, you're not going to be able to argue it later on. So all these groups who wanted to pull out of North Carolina and now Texas and some other places that have pending bathroom gender laws, fine, you can cancel, but you're going to pay a cancellation fee unless you had that mentioned in your force majeure clause. That's all there is to it. The last one says, any act or occurrence, any act or occurrence creating a significant risk to the health or safety of potential attendees. I'm thinking about SARS and Ebola and all that, but I don't name those terms because it could be a different name next week. Damage or harm, okay, I've already talked about that. Acts of terrorists, and I say, or specific threats. In other words, if the Ayatollah says they're going to be dropping bombs on the city where your meeting takes place next week, you're not going to get very many people to show up just to see if he's bluffing or not. I'm not showing up. I'm not showing up to see if the Ayatollah is going to be, sending the Scud missiles to my headquarter hotel like he said he was. So you got to react to threats. You shouldn't have to wait until the morning of to see if the bombs come before you react to it, because your attendees aren't going to wait till the morning of. They're not going to get in their car or get on the plane and show up. So you got to react to threats. I'm going kind of fast, but these are all written down in your handout material. Obviously cancellation or restriction of commercial travel to or from the meeting location. If you're using a convention center, I tie the convention center together with the availability of the hotels, inability of the parties to, first of all, negotiate a mutually agreeable license agreement, or the inability or unwillingness of the convention center to provide the actual facility over the meeting date. So even if you have a license agreement in place, if the convention center overbooks later on and it's not available, you should have the right to terminate that agreement with them, but that also needs to be as a contingency clause in your hotel contracts as well. Use of two or more hotels, unavailability of a sufficient number of hotel rooms suitable to meeting sponsor for use within X mile radius of the convention center. You fill that in on a case-by-case basis. Because you can't, this is important, because you don't sign, most groups don't sign the convention center contract and all the hotel contracts on the same day. Usually you sign the convention center once and then you go out and sign your hotel contracts in the coming months. You negotiate with them. And if you sign your convention center contract first, then the hotels know you have a definite agreement, then they're not going to negotiate with you because they know you're locked into coming because you've got a convention center license. And same thing, if you sign all your hotel contracts and then you're negotiating your convention center license, if you don't have the right to get out of those hotel contracts, the convention center's got nothing to negotiate. They're not negotiate with you because they know you're locked into coming anyway. I've gone kind of fast on this. I'll put my contact information up there again, and look at my timer. I got 10 seconds to go. So we're ending on time. I'm going to hang around for a little while if you got any questions, but I'm supposed to encourage you now to go next door where we're going to do our painting exercise. But if you do have questions, either email me, give me a call, and I'll be happy to talk to you. Thanks very much for signing in and online too.